We are going to our panel 6, Pandemic, Hate Speech on Social Media During COVID-19. Mutlu Binark will be the chair. Mutlu Binark is a professor in Hacettepe University, Faculty of Communication, Department of Informatics and Information Technologies. She is one of the founding members of the Alternative Informatics Association. She has been the editor of Moment magazine since July 2017. She is the blogger of www.yenimedia.wordpress.com. Now I would like to give the floor to Mutlu Binark. Welcome.
Thank you very much, dear Merve. It's an honor and a great pleasure for me to moderate this panel because we are going to hear two very fresh research papers from valuable researchers. I believe that hate speech during COVID-19 pandemic really left its mark on the social media. This was not only limited to the Chinese, to the Asian, it also concerned everyone actually, LGBTI members, the elderly. The Turkish social network turned into a huge hate speech production web. So hearing these two research papers will be eye-opening for us, and we will think about how to fight against it in the Q&A session. Now, the first report, it was prepared by the members of the Alternative Informatics Association, a monitoring report. It's titled Hate Speech in the Social Media During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Zeynep Özarslan, İlden, Dirini, and Gökçe Özsu will be presenting. Zeynep Özarslan received her undergraduate and graduate degree in Department of Foreign Languages at Marmara University. She holds a PhD in Communication Sciences. She has been working as a lecturer in various public and foundation universities in Istanbul. She has the following books: Discourse and Ideology on Suicide, Panopticon, The Power of I. She provides contribution to some non-governmental organizations to combat hate speech in new media. İlden Dirini is one of the founding members of the Alternative Informatics Association. She received her undergraduate degree in Media and Communication and International Relations at Anadolu University. Some of her fields of work are hate speech and new media, freedom of speech, gender equality, and social memory. She is also a member of the Open Data and Data Journalism Association. She also contributes to Hafıza Kaydı as a researcher and writer. Gökçe Özsu received his undergraduate degree in International Relations at Ankara University, Faculty of Political Sciences, and graduate degree in Media and Visual Studies at Bilkent University. He worked for several media outlets and as a fixer for international news agencies. His research interests are cultural policies, discourse studies, and new media and journalism studies. He currently holds the YÖK, the High Council of Education Scholarship, 100 to 2000 scholarship. So they will be presenting this report to us. They have 15 minutes. I am going to follow the time limit, and I am going to give them a signal when they have 5 minutes left. So first of all, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Zeynep Özarslan. I would like to thank all the participants in advance for enriching our discussions with their questions.
We would like to thank Ranting Foundation, the Frederick Naumann Foundation, and the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs for hosting us for the organization. And thanks to the organization and Science Committee and the participants for this important and timely conference. We are very excited and honored to be part of it. Okay. So we would like to share our report on hate speech in social media during COVID-19 pandemic in Turkey. We, the speakers, Zeynep Özarslan, İlden, Dirini, and Gökçe Özsu, are the members of Alternative Informatics Association. And we've been closely monitoring the hate speech in social media since the first days of the pandemic. İlden, Dirini, and Gökçe Özsu have written the report on hate speech in social media in the COVID-19 pandemic period under my editorship. The report is published both in Turkish and English with the financial support of European Union with the framework of the European Union's Civilization Program. And to keep track of the hate speech in social media during the pandemic in Turkey, we monitored ethnic-based ageism, age discrimination, and sexual identity orientation-based hate speech in our report. Ethnic identity-based hate speech is frequently produced in Turkey. However, during the pandemic, we witnessed for the first time that Chinese people and Asians have been subjected to hate speech in Turkey. Similarly, age-based hate speech has been mass-produced for the first time in Turkey too. We define ageism as the exposure of people to discriminatory attitudes, behaviors, and practices only because of their biological age. Ageism includes negative attitudes based on prejudice and stereotypes such as being ignored or disregarded, as well as implicit and explicit practices such as isolation, segregation, abuse, harassment, and physical violence. Based on socio-political developments in Turkey, the scope of the report has been determined as between February the 1st and June the 1st, 2020. These developments are: February the 1st, the Turkish students in China were evacuated and put in quarantine for 2 weeks. But the first COVID-19 case was officially announced on the 11th of March. And March the 21st, the government banned the individuals over the age of 65 and citizens with chronic illnesses from leaving their residences and going out. And the third one is April the 24th. President of Religious Affairs, Professor Ali Erbash, claimed in his weekly sermon that the religion of Islam condemned adultery and homosexuality because of it illegitimately spread HIV and other viruses. So we've only included YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter in the report. The reason for this is based on the number of daily active users in the most used social networks in Turkey, as stated in the 2019 report of We Are Social and Hootsuite. We had some ethical concerns as well in the report. And the contents included in the analysis were obtained by searching the text for each social network on different dates. We have not included the other relevant hashtags. For ethical reasons, we anonymized the data and described them in different words without interfering with the meaning and context. Similarly, we depicted visual contents by text. Both traditional and the following free tools were used, you see in the slide, to extract data with the specified text. YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook content were manually coded without using any digital tools. Cobri was used for YouTube comments, and Spatula Instagram comments, Grabber for Instagram comments. Twitter content was collected by pulling data through Workbench tool. So the obtained contents were separated into previously defined hate speech categories. Then the frequency of these categories was quantitatively calculated and visualized with tables. The contents included in the analysis were collected in common coding table. The visual contents are textualized, including in the coding table. The interaction of the data of the content and or comments are not included in the coding table. The coding was done and compared separately by the authors of the report, and the editor's opinion was sought for the disputed content. Thus, a consensus was reached in the context of categorization criteria on all contents included in the analysis. The content and comments subjected to analysis are classified according to the categories, these categories. The first one is exaggeration, attribution, distortion. The second, swearing, insult, defamation. The third, enmity, war discourse. The fourth, symbolization. The first four categories have been chosen as used in media hate speech monitoring reports prepared by International Hunting Foundation since April 2009. And the fifth one is objection, while exhibiting negative labeling, especially on the food culture, dehumanizing the other as barbarian, removing their eating and drinking habits from being the object of desire. And that objection category is adapted from the analysis of Professor Mutlu Binark in the early stages of pandemic. And the last one is space coating. blaming only a certain group for all the negative developments and turning them into object of fear. And scapegoating is a frequently used concept in populism studies and is borrowed from Professor Ruth Wodak. It is seen that a significant part of the content and comments can be included in more than one category. However, the content and comments obtained within the scope of this report were coded to be classified under a single category. Priority in categorization was given to the most emphasized category. Now, Gökçe Özsu will share the findings of the research with us. So I can unmute myself.
So thank you, Professor Özarslan. As she recently mentioned, we are sharing our findings in 3 categories. These are hate speech against Chinese people, hate speech against the elderly, and the last one is the one against LGBT plus individuals. Unfortunately, we won't be able to share most of the examples and the findings, but our report is available for free on the internet. I would like to start with the hate speech against the Chinese people first. We have found that more than 30% of the YouTube videos and more than 10% of the YouTube comments contain hate speech. But what is interesting for these findings is nearly half of the videos were logged to the user comments. For videos and comments, the most frequent hate speech category is swearing, insult, and defamation category. Even though all hate speech categories were available in the YouTube comments, enmity and war discourse has not been found in the YouTube videos. If you look at how the swearing category was produced, we saw that the users had bad soup image. It was an assumption that bad soup was one of the main parts of Chinese food culture. We also saw that not only the Chinese people, but also Asians were subjected to humiliation based on their physical appearances. I would like to mention the objection category in this sense. YouTube comments are the most highly produced sample in objection category. It is common both for videos and comments. The Chinese and Asian food culture is depicted as filthy, inferior, inhumane, and apart from the object of desire. We can also see the scapegoat category. We can see scapegoating as the Chinese people are responsible for the pandemic and related social affairs. If we move on Instagram, we found that more than 70% of Instagram posts and more than 40% of Instagram comments contain hate speech. It is interesting for both Instagram posts and comments because there was distinction between us and them produced by the discourse of enmity. It is not common, but we observed many calls for genocide against Chinese people. In Twitter posts, we observed more than 7% of the contents are hate speech. Much of the hate speech comes from the enmity category. The users depicted the Chinese people as enemies and ones deserving a divine punishment because they were responsible for the pandemic. But it's also interesting that the users call for a divine judgment for the oppression against Uyghur people, which are also ethno-religious minority in China. In Facebook posts, our first finding is that we haven't observed any hate groups and hate pages on Facebook. We have seen that the objection and enmity categories are the most common ones. You can see the examples on the report as well. I would like to move on to hate speech categories against the elderly people. In YouTube videos, the biggest part of the hate speech belongs to the exaggeration, attribution, and distortion category. Beyond the categories, representation practices of the elderly in general seemed highly problematic. We have observed that elderly people were often depicted sarcastically. Even though sarcasm seemed not to have produced hate speech, still we can consider that as a discrimination. This is for the YouTube videos. In YouTube comments, we observed that the elderly ones who don't follow the quarantine rules are subjected to direct insult and humiliation due to their old age. Moreover, they were depicted with forgetfulness and selfishness attribution. In Instagram posts, we haven't seen any posts that contain hate speech. It's quite interesting and we don't know why. Actually, we observed many Instagram posts containing hate speech before they have been criticized by the public. As we know, some have been subjected to criminal sanctions for insulting the elderly ones, and we couldn't access these contents after the sanctions. If you look at the Instagram comments, we could find very limited numbers of Instagram comments that contained hate speech. Swearing category is on the top of them and seem to be against the elderly ones who didn't follow the curfew rules. In Twitter posts, after excluding news content, we have found that more than 46% of the contents had hate speech. Above this, the most common category was swearing, insult, and defamation. In this category, people over 65 years was depicted as disobedient and irresponsible. And what's interesting, We the Youngsters Protect the Elderly Ones was produced and circulated.
5 dakika.
Okay, Mutlu Hocam. In Facebook posts, fortunately, we have found solidarity communities instead of hate speech content. One of the groups had a sharing policy and it was no hate speech allowed. If you look at the post, most of them is the reaction to the ban. I mean, how restrictions impact their health negatively because they have been not going for exercise. As an interesting point, some members call friend of faith to each other. I would like to move on the hate speech against LGBT plus individuals quickly. In YouTube videos, we found several numbers of hate speech content, but most of them are not user-generated content. But they were mostly commercial TV news content, which are out of scope. So I'm skipping this part. In YouTube comments, more than 21% of the contents contained hate speech. We can say that all categories contain swearing practices. In this point, I would like to talk about the second largest category, which is enmity discourse. In enmity category, warmongering against LGBTI plus individuals and against the right defenders. There was distinction between us and them, and it was created between fundamentalist Muslims and LGBT plus individuals. In Instagram posts, more than 46% contained hate speech. There are two categories on the top. We observed that the users accuse LGBT individuals of religious humiliation. This humiliation is based on the assumption that one day the whole society would become LGBT individuals unless right activists being stopped. In the enmity discourse, warmongering is on the fore and based on the assumption that LGBT plus individuals waged war against the religion of Islam by defending LGBT rights. In Instagram comments, we observed swearing the most. The only thing we saw is the random swearing. But what's interesting, we also observed metonymical references to the myth of Lot, Lot the prophet. We know that it's the most common discourse and currently used by the head of Turkish religious affairs, the Diyanet. What's more interesting, while the head of Diyanet used this metonymy by labeling LGBT community carriers of disease in order to create a reference between the Lot myth and the pandemic, but the users didn't do so interestingly. In Twitter posts, we saw many hashtags against the LGBT community, such as LGBT activities shall be punished, Istanbul Convention shall be suspended, go to the Netherlands. We saw that almost all contents under these hashtags have hate speech. The interesting point was enmity discourse and swearing discourse are intertwined. These categories, LGBT community is labeled as the enemy of the state, enemies of the Islamic religion as well. For now, I've shared a small piece of the findings. In overall, I can say that the number of the groups subjected to hate speech is rising during the pandemic in Turkey. We know that ethnic, sexual, and religious minorities in Turkey has always been exposed to hate speech. Chinese, Asians, and elderly ones seem to add it to the list. Swearing category are the most common for all the groups, but objection and scapegoating are the new categories and unique in the hate speech against the Chinese people. But overall, these categories are getting hard to separate and identify because we observe that many categories are intertwined. For further studies, we should focus more changing characteristics of hate speech categories. So thank you very much.
Gökçe Özsu'ya çok teşekkür ederim.
Thank you very much, Gökçe Özsu, and thank you very much for keeping in line with the time as well. And also, this is a good segue to the next presentation as well, mentioning the enmity feelings against the Chinese. And also we're talking about the Sinovac vaccine as well, the vaccine developed by the Chinese as well. There's a lot of discussion about that too. And I believe this is going to deepen our understanding of why this hate is directed towards the Chinese as well. Now, I would like to give the floor to the next speakers. First of all, Oğuz Kuş received his undergraduate degree from Marmara University Faculty of Communication, and he has obtained his graduate and PhD degrees from Istanbul University Institute of Social Sciences. He now works at Istanbul University Faculty of Communication as research assistant, focuses on hate speech and new media, critical data studies, big data, data mining, and content marketing. And he also engages in Doba Faculty of Applied Business and Social Studies and School of Journalism and Public Relations in Northern Macedonia as well. And Yıldıray Kesgin has received his undergraduate degree from Kadir University Department of Advertising, and he received his graduate degree from Yeditepe University. He's now studying in new media, social media, women's studies, LGBTI rights, hate speech, freedom, human rights, racism, and anti-racism. And this presentation is going to be focusing on big data in terms of minority rights. I would like to now give the floor to Oğuz Kuş and Yıldıray Kesgin.
Bu yönüyle aslında bir referans noktası da belirliyoruz. İleriye doğru nasıl bir değişim gerçekleşecek?
We believe that our study is going to inform how our thoughts shape as we go along. We work with hate speech definitions made by Almagor Parek and the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. These are the definitions that we base our study on, and we use these definitions to determine whether there's hate speech or not in a particular discourse. And we also have a digital hate speech component as well. And we define this as the sharing on social platforms or websites of discourse, including hate and discriminatory messages, or the designing of discriminatory and hateful games, and having video and podcast releases, including hate speech. This is how we define digital hate speech. And we know that there are certain definitions that the social media platforms, as a matter of fact, developed, and the policies that they have developed in order to prevent hateful content to be from being shared. Moreover, digital hate speech has different parameters. I would like to mention research here. Basically, this research says that hate speech can be generated and can be accessed more easily in the new media than in the traditional media because of digitality, interaction, virtuality, and multimedia formation. And we can also divide digital hate speech to direct and indirect digital hate speech. As a matter of fact, direct hate speech is the generation and sharing of hateful content, but indirect hate speech is more about social media dynamics. This means the interaction of a user with that content. For example, liking a post, or retweeting it, resharing it, or even just viewing it, as a matter of fact, can be regarded as indirect hate speech. And also, interaction is a very important part of the social media algorithms as well. And that is why we also look into the numbers of interactions as well in our study. And under COVID-19, there's a lot of hate speech generated too, for example, especially against Asians and the Chinese. There was a concerning rise there, and also the Chinese are demonized and conspiracy theories are generated about the Chinese are otherized, and the Chinese culture is belittled. And again, in indirect hate speech,
nefret söylemi üreten ve buna karşı çıkan kullanıcıların etkileşim içinde olduğu
the creators of hateful content are in interaction as well, it is said, and also the people who are exposed to hate speech, again, are more likely, have more proclivity to generate hate speech as well. Also, the way that news stories about the coronavirus were made also fuels this hateful content against the Chinese as well. Therefore, this sort of environment appears in which to create hateful content in social media. And we can see that a lot of hateful content can be generated during the COVID-19 crisis as well. We have different categories that we have set as well based on based on our literature review. So first of all, economic hateful speech, cultural and political and physical cultural hate speech. The last one being about the physical characteristics of the people who are the targets of hate speech. And this was very important for our study because we have used data mining in our study. That is why we need to create a training set, a training kit, and these categories have to be predefined in order for us to be able to do that. Let's start with the research questions. We first of all asked, what is the thematic rate of hate speech against the Chinese before the first case of COVID-19 was found out in Turkey, and also what kind of linguistic usages are there in user-sourced digital content, and also what is the thematic interaction level of hate speech on digital environment. The data collection started with the collection of the comments, of the primary user comments in a video before the detection of the first COVID-19 case in Turkey, and we have collected the comments of more than 17,000 users and more than 190,000 interactions, and we have used the Face Pager tool, and the top 3,000 rows of data were included in the research. We have adopted a hybrid approach. We have used content analysis, and we have also devised a process in which the researchers were directly involved. Therefore, that was a classical content analysis. And also we have used data mining, as mentioned before. And intercoder reliability was calculated with Cohen-Kasper. We have used Young, McCracken's and Crouston's model in the hybrid content analysis model. This has three processes: human coding, machine coding, and adjustment. In human coding, we have collected 1,000, we have coded 1,000 human comments, and to calculate the reliability, 10% of the data collected was removed, and then the remaining 10% was calculated with Cohen's kappa coefficient, and then we created our algorithm with Rapid Mining Studio on 1,000 comments. Then the non-categorized 2,000 comments were classified with the algorithm created with 1,000, with the first 1,000 comments. At the end of the machine coding, there was a very high certainty already in the data. That is why we wanted to have a random controlling, as a matter of fact, random adjustment. And then the researchers have checked this, And there was a 96% agreement between the researchers and the machine. And the findings that we have are that 5% of the covered comments included hate speech. 60% of the hate speech, hateful content was about culture, 40% was about politics, and the other categories were at a very reduced level, as a matter of fact. 5% of the current data set was hateful content, as we said, but we saw that they received more than double the amount of likes than the other comments got. The hateful content received 133 likes on average, while non-hateful content received about 58 likes. We used GQ to create a network map. By the way, the thicker lines means more frequency of the use of words. There is a lot of activity around bat soup, maybe you can see, and also the kitchen culture, the cuisine, again, gets attacked, gets targeted a lot as well. On the political side, the words Uyghur and East Turkestan appear a lot. In conclusion, it is very remarkable that we found out there was a lot of lack of knowledge about Chinese culture. A lot of the findings were about the cuisine, and the internet legends and misinformation played a lot of a role in the creation of hate speech, cultural hate speech. There was a dichotomic perspective in the political hate speech creation that was apparent, and people were seeing Muslims and Uyghurs as us, and the Chinese were positioned as the perpetrators of violence against Uyghurs, and for which they were punished with COVID-19. And it is also important to mention that indirect hate speech played a lot of role in the creation of hateful content as well. Thank you very much for listening to us, for your patience, and would like to answer your questions now if you have any.